Only woodblock prints can perfectly symbolize modern Chinese history.
Woodblock printing began in China well over 1,000 years ago. It's an art that's closely linked to the fate of Chinese people.
There has never been another art form so closely linked to a revolution than Chinese woodblock printing. An art form that so accurately mirrors the immense social and political upheaval of China's last century. Woodblock printing was used to protest against the social injustices of the time and to illustrate the great suffering endured. It was also a vehicle used to propagate the communist cause. This was an art form that not only portrayed society, but also helped shape it. And it was an art form with a 1,000-year-old tradition. A tradition that was built on extraordinary invention. The Chinese first invented papermaking and then developed printing 1,000 years before the West. The ancient skills of papermaking are still alive in many parts of China. Here in Sichuan, they use bamboo and grass as the raw material. The invention of paper revolutionized the dissemination of information across China. Paper provided the plentiful and cheap material for the production of manuscripts and books. Huge libraries were established. Images carved on stones and bricks began during the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago. The earliest illustrated printed book is a Buddhist text, the Diamond Sutra, printed in 868. It's held at the British Library in London. There were also numerous printed religious sheets, book illustrations for instruction manuals and novels. Many popular prints for auspicious occasions were also produced throughout history. Of the 20th century, China entered an era of uncertainty. Over 2,000 years of dynastic rule ended, and with it, a new mood of self-expression began. Demonstrations called for a national awakening to modernize China through science and democracy. Wealth went hand in hand with grinding poverty. In the 1930s, left-wing right-hand critic Lu Xun became the founder of what came to be called the modern woodcut movement. He introduced European social realism and called on artists to create prints that would become educational and propaganda tools. He hoped that these images would shake people and make them aware of China's weaknesses. He wrote, "The function of woodblock is, by nature, social education. By using its characteristic contrasts of black and white, it can express powerful emotions. Its rich techniques can depict the diverse aspects of society and life." Lu Xun inspired generations of print artists.
Lu Xun guided the modern woodcut movement. We all admired him.
Lu Xun encouraged artists to use woodcuts to show the misery of people's lives, their hopes and struggles.
79-year-old artist Zhao Yannian has been inspired by Lu Xun's writing for years. He has illustrated many of Lu Xun's books. The most famous is The True Story of RQ.
RQ has the darkest soul of all people. Lu Xun wrote RQ in order to make us Chinese think hard about ourselves. And RQ's dark side exists in all of us. While I was in prison during the Cultural Revolution, I reread the story and I decided to carve images to illustrate his words. Although I was too young to meet Lu Xun, I am deeply grateful to him. He has influenced my whole life.
The power vacuum left by the end of dynastic rule spilled over into civil war. The battle between the nationalists and the communists tore the country apart, and in order to survive, the communist forces began the famous Long March. Finally, Yan'an, in the arid north, became the base for the communist movement. Youths from all over the country, attracted by communism, traveled to Yan'an. Among them were two art students, Yan Han and Wang Qi, now in their late 80s.
I was preparing to go to France and had spent 3 years learning French. Then in 1937, Japan invaded China. I was very patriotic and influenced by communist propaganda, so instead of traveling to France, I joined the revolution.
I chose to go to Yan'an because I was a hot-blooded youth of 20 who wanted to join the revolution. While I was there, Yan'an and I lived in the same cave.
The Lu Xun Academy of Literature and Art was established in 1938. Mao praised Lu Xun as the leader of the revolution in Chinese culture. Yan Han and Wang Qi studied there and later became two of the most renowned artists in China.
I was very happy and keen to do anything. I studied in the Lu Xun Academy for 3 months. Actually, I didn't learn a thing about art. It was all political education. As an art student, I was taught that art was for art's sake, that art was holy, untouchable, and above politics. But in Yan'an, we were re-educated. Art should serve the people and help achieve victory in the anti-Japanese war.
In 1942, Mao addressed the teachers and students of the academy at a conference on literature and art. Mao told artists and writers to focus on the struggle of the masses. Art should serve the people.
Mao's talk had a huge influence on us. We saw it as our guiding light and tried to follow it.
1943, I returned to Yan'an. There was a political purge to cleanse the party. It was really fierce, similar to the Cultural Revolution. Later that summer, Mao's talk was circulated, and we had to study it. It asked who art should serve. The answer was the workers, peasants, and soldiers. How to serve? It was important to popularize art and get workers and peasants to understand your work. Its aim was propaganda. It was totally for political purposes. Mao's talk had absolute power.
Art to serve the people became the direction of art and literature for the next 50 years. After 8 years of anti-Japanese war and 4 years of civil war, the communists won the battle against the nationalists and established the People's Republic of China in 1949. Energy and resources were spent on land reform and the construction of a new China. By 1953, a degree of political stability had been reached, and from then on till the early 1960s, woodblock artists created many images of the confident and resilient China, depicting the new Chinese people and their new ideology.
The main theme of woodcuts at the time was industrial construction and agricultural development. We were building our socialist country. Industrial construction was impressive. Before the liberation, we showed people being exploited and suppressed and people's struggle. Now in the new China, it was different. We were developing our country.
The style of prints from this period could be branded revolutionary romanticism. It was a particularly intense form of socialist realism. Art was serving the people, but the artists themselves had concerns.
Prints from the 1950s mirrored reality, and this was good. A major drawback was the lack of artistic freedom. At that time, you daren't mention individuality or what you liked. It had to be what peasants and workers liked.
In the mid-1950s, the party put forward a policy called letting 100 flowers bloom. People were encouraged to speak openly. But in reality, it was a scheme set up by Mao to reveal forces ranged against him. Many outspoken intellectuals were condemned as rightists. Yan Han was by then a professor at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing.
In 1957, the party began a campaign called the Free Airing of Views. We were asked to give our opinions. We had countless meetings inviting us to criticize the party. At first, I didn't want to speak, but they asked me again and again, and so I criticized Akada on a very small issue. I also suggested that all art students should learn how Western painters sketched. I was accused of rejecting Chinese traditions and was condemned as a capitalist rightist. I was severely punished. I was expelled from the party, downgraded 5 levels, my salary cut in half and sent to be reformed by hard labor. Altogether, it was 21 years of my life.
In the 60s, the political situation changed from bad to worse. The Cultural Revolution began in May '66, and by June, art academies had ceased to function, and all institutions had been taken over by the Red Guards.
When the Red Guards were rampant, I was labelled a rightist, a capitalist scholar, an anti-revolutionary painter, a devil, a demon, an enemy of Mao. They had massive rallies to criticize us. I had a placard hanging from my neck, my name written on it with a large cross through it. We were made to bend down, hands forced behind us. It was really painful. We also got beaten. We were jailed in a little hut for several years. At that time, you could only endure. Some people tried to fight, but you would be beaten to death if you tried. Some even committed suicide.
We heard news from Beijing that the Red Guards were coming. We would be labeled devils, our hair shaved and placards hung around our necks. I heard the news and I couldn't face it, so I decided to kill myself. My wife told me that I had to live for her and the children. I promised her that I would. Several days later, the Red Guards came to get me. The 10-minute walk from my home to the college became the distance between my being turned from a man into a beast. At the front door of the college, they forced me to stand on a chair, poured a bucket of ink over my head, cut off my hair, and hung a placard around my neck. So I became a monster and a devil.
Many established artists lost their positions, were imprisoned and forbidden to create any artworks. Printmaking became a collective process by students and amateurs. All the arts of this period followed a strict pattern, heroic and grand postures and bright colours. Body language became dramatic. Good characters glow as if spotlit, and bad characters are shadowed in darkness. Nevertheless, the energy of many prints of this period still shine through. Zhang Minjie was 8 years old when the Cultural Revolution began.
My love of woodblock printing began when I was very little. I was in my first year of primary school, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution in 1966. Chairman Mao's portrait by woodcut was very popular. I saw people carving and printing, and I was deeply impressed. As a child, I thought it was fun. When I finished high school in 1975, I applied to go to the countryside. I spent over a year there and got to know the harsh reality of peasant life. While I was in the countryside, I made woodblock prints. The theme was all about passionate youth being re-educated in the countryside. The colors had to be red, bright and shiny. And all the people are raising their hands and have grand postures like this.
But for established artists, the times were hard.
In my heart, I knew that I had joined the revolution as a student and had never betrayed the party or the people. I'd even been given medals as a soldier. I always believed things would change. History wouldn't always be like this. Mao won't live forever. So many people were miserable. People's anger was deep, and one day it would explode. But I wasn't sure if I could live to see that day.
The Cultural Revolution lasted 10 years. For artist Yu Qihui, a futile experience.
During the Cultural Revolution, all art was false. It was as if we had gone into a dead end, and it was not easy to get out. The whole process cost us 20 years. Even after the Cultural Revolution finished, we couldn't think straight. Our work was still caught in the shadow of that period. We were also scared and uncertain about the future. In the end, all our generation had the same thought, that our best time, our youth, had been wasted and would never return.
Mao's death in 1976 ended the Cultural Revolution. The open-door policy and reform were announced soon afterwards. Cultural policy changed to allow artists the freedom to choose a style of their own. Propaganda was no longer the prime purpose of art. This artistic freedom was something the old generation of artists had never enjoyed before.
After the open-door policy, you could paint whatever you liked. Abstract, exaggeration. Take Yannian, for example. His style changed a lot. He was badly suppressed before.
I have suffered enough, so now I paint whatever I want. I've made a seal that reads, "I do as I please." Nowadays I paint and do whatever I feel like.
For younger artists, change was not swift enough. Chen Haiyan was a student at the National Academy in the early 1980s. She found it impossible to paint what she wanted, the images of her dreams.
At
that time, if you were an artist at an academy, you didn't count as an individual. When work was sent for exhibition, the academy wanted all of them to have the same theme. It had to have a propaganda purpose, like the development of society or similar. You couldn't express your individual thoughts, such as dreams. They thought this too removed from reality. So it wasn't possible for me to paint my dream series then. Once I had graduated, I promised myself that I would do my own thing and that no one would control me anymore.
From the mid-1980s, dream images and text had been the main subject of Chen Haiyan's artwork.
Before going to sleep, I placed the block next to my bed. On waking early in the morning, I would quickly note down my dream, then transfer the idea onto the block. Then after breakfast, I started carving. That whole year, I created 22 works. I still didn't let anyone see them. They were just to make me feel better.
The 1980s saw China flooded with new ideas and trends. Young Chinese artists found it stimulating but challenging. Chen Qi among them.
As Chinese artists, we have the weight of thousands of years of traditional painting on our shoulders, and it's difficult to find a way out. I felt that all I could do was to rebel and run away. Then, in the 80s, after the open door policy, many books and Western styles arrived. All young artists were confused and lost. We didn't know which way to turn. We felt we were finished. For us, Western painting is young and full of life, whereas traditional Chinese art feels old and almost dead. So naturally, we chose Western painting.
With so many ideas in circulation, young artists searched for their own voice and style. In 1988, Xu Bing, who had created many lyrical prints on rural topics, started to create his groundbreaking work, The Book from the Sky.
Our generation all have an awkward relationship with books and language. It's a sort of abnormal relationship. My parents were intellectuals at Beijing University, and from very little I was surrounded by books. I loved the smell and feel of books. By the time I could read, the Cultural Revolution had started and there was nothing for us to read. The whole country was reading just one book, Mao's Little Red Book. After the open door policy, all sorts of books were available and I read a huge amount and joined in all sorts of discussions. But after a while, I felt uncomfortable and completely lost. I felt my mind was stuffed full. It's rather like a starved person suddenly being given too much food and overeating. I felt ill with all the books, culture and debates. That's when I decided to produce my own book. On the surface, The Book from the Sky looks like a very traditional Chinese book, but its concept is very modern.
The book was printed with 4,000 imaginary Chinese characters, which looked similar to Chinese text. It was presented and bound in a very traditional form, but it was a book that nobody could read.
Usually the people doesn't think you should exactly to do it. The idea is super, it's a good idea, but if you exactly to do it is kind of crazy, you know. When I had the idea, I'm exciting, so I talked to the friends. They all think, oh, that's a good idea, yeah. But after a few months, you know, they couldn't find me, you know. They don't know what I'm doing, where I'm going. So finally, they know, oh, I always lock myself in my studio, carving the nonsense character. They think, oh, the Xu Bing's crazy, yeah. So, yeah, so, but, you know, China is kind of like a crazy society, right? 就是它社会其实不正常。
Chinese society is abnormal, so you have to do something abnormal to cope with it.
Post-1989, there was a widespread sense of loss among intellectuals and artists. Many embarked on their own long march in search of spiritual liberty, modernity, and individuality. The utopianism and hopefulness of the 80s was abandoned. Political pop and cynical realism arrived in China with a vengeance. Fan Lijun was one of the leading artists of the post-1989 Chinese avant-garde movement. Fan Lijun's trademark is shaven-headed images. They represent rebellion, satire, personal escape, and indifference to society. Other artists turned back to Chinese tradition, both in image and technique, for inspiration. One was Chen Qi.
The motifs I chose, furniture and instruments, are the essence of Chinese culture. And I use the most traditional Chinese technique, water-based printing, to make them. But the composition of the images is modern, so I have been able to use the best of both worlds.
Chen Qi is preparing his latest vast work for exhibition.
There are three elements in this work: Chinese landscape, Buddha's hand, and the butterfly. The butterfly has clear, symbolic meaning. And it has a human face. That's me. In the background is a typical Chinese landscape representing the renunciation of the world. The Buddhist hand is engaging with the world.
One of the new breed of young artists is Wang Chao. His work looks back firmly to China's golden past. But his individualism is paramount.
The older generation of artists see my work as preserving and promoting ancient Chinese culture. In fact, my prints are modern, not traditional. What I am doing is trying to carry out those ancient traditions. What I hope is to find a way of communicating those traditions to modern society and to influence contemporary prints. My prints are usually tranquil, with simple colors. This has a lot to do with my longing for the life of a literati. The work looks inward. Even the smallest ancient object has humanity and spirit. Contemporary things just don't have this. I don't belong to that revolutionary past. I have my own environment and philosophical thoughts. I want to search back into ancient China and describe those old times, its smell and color. So my prints are very different from the modern woodcut movement. My prints don't serve anybody. They are all to do with what I like and what I possess. I'm very selfish in this respect. That's for sure.